How the Yakut built mud houses to survive the coldest winters. At negative 71 degrees Celsius. Architecture documentary. At 71 degrees below zero, the cold does not merely freeze you. It hunts down the water molecules inside your very cells, crystallizes them, and tears your flesh apart from the inside out. In this frozen expanse, located in the deep, remote valleys of northeastern Siberia, the rules of physical behavior seem to warp and bend under the weight of an unforgiving climate. Steel becomes as brittle as thin glass, shattering at the strike of a hammer. Huge larch trees, frozen solid to their cores, suddenly explode in the dead of night with a raid sound like a rifle shot as their internal sap expands. Yet, in this incredibly hostile environment, the Yakut people have carved out a life for generations, not by fighting the extreme cold, but by understanding its laws. Our story begins in the late September of 1892 in the high valley of Oymyakon. The autumn wind is already carrying the sharp scent of the Arctic, and the froof ground is rapidly turning to iron. Dulan, a quiet and observant Yakut father, stands on a small rise overlooking the frozen river, watching the heavy gray clouds gather on the horizon. He knows the signs. The elders have warned that the upcoming winter will be a monster, a historic freeze that will test the survival limits of everyone in the settlement. Dulan's family is vulnerable. His wife, Chaska, has been working tirelessly to dry the last of the autumn fish, while their oldest daughter, Alton, helps tend to their small herd of dwarf, Yakutian cows. But it is their youngest, 7-year-old Sarah, who worries Dulan the most. She has carried a delicate, rattling chest cold since the previous spring, and Dulan knows that another winter spent in a drafty, poorly insulated shelter could prove fatal. Dulan's dwarf cows are small, thick-furred beasts, uniquely adapted to the clod's Siberian climate, but even they require shelter when the true deep freeze sets in. Dulan knows that his current shelter is decaying. The wooden supports have rotted, and the Siberian winds will easily find their way through the gaps. To save his family and his livestock, Dulan must construct a new balagan, a traditional Yakut mud house. This is not a project born of pride or a desire for a nucamator comfort. It is a matter of pure biological preservation. Dulan moves with a blank, deliberate, slow-paced calm, collecting the necessary timber, straw, and clay before the ground freezes completely solid. Every shovel of earth and every log selected is a calculated decision, a silent pact between a father and the unforgiving landscape. He knows that in Oymyakon, a single construction mistake is not just an inconvenience, it is a death sentence. As the first light snow begins to fall, dusting his dark fur coat, Dulan turns back to his workshop, ready to begin a construction process that has kept his ancestors alive for hundreds of years in the coldest inhabited place on Earth. Just a few hundred yards from Dulan's homestead, a very different kind of construction is underway. Stepan, a wealthy and ambitious imperial fur trader, has recently arrived in the Oymyakon Valley to establish a permanent trading post. Stepan is a man who believes in the absolute superiority of modern progress and industrial materials. He has brought several sled loads of heavy iron spikes, massive pine logs, and, most impressively, large panes of thick glass imported at great expense from the city of Irkutsk. Stepan is building a traditional Russian izba, a grand, flat-walled log cabin designed to showcase his wealth and status to the local population. Stepan watches Dulan's preparations with a mixture of amusement and outright disdain. One afternoon, as Dulan is hauling a heavy cart of wet, straw-mixed clay and cow manure toward his building site, Stepan stops him along the trail. Stepan looks at the heap of organic material, laughs, and tells Dulan that he is building a stable to live in, rather than a proper home. Stepan boasts about his own flat-walled cabin, explaining that his thick vertical logs and iron spikes will hold any storm at bay, while his glass windows will let in the winter light. He tells Dulon that manure belongs in the fields, not plastered onto the fortius, walls of a human dwelling, and warns him that he is wasting his time on a primitive, dirty hut. Dulon listens to the merchant's boasts with a quiet, polite patience, refusing to argue or defend his ancestral methods. He simply nods, tells Stepan that he hopes the Russian's cabin stays warm, and continues hauling his cart. Dulon understands what Stepan does not. Stepan's flat-walled, straight-sided cabin is built on pride, but it ignores the fundamental laws of cold-weather physics. Thick pine logs are strong, but they expand and contract significantly as the temperature drops, pulling loose from iron spikes that freeze and shrink at different rates. The flat vertical walls of the izba will act as a giant sail, catching the brutal Siberian winds head-on and allowing the wind to scour thermal energy directly from the wood. Stepan's massive glass windows will look beautiful in the autumn sun, but they will act as giant thermal drains once the temperature drops, bleeding heat out of the house faster than any fire can replace it. Dulon moves back to his own building site, his mind focused entirely on the work. He knows that the true judge of their contrasting methods is not the opinions of the lumberyard, but the Siberian winter itself, which is already beginning to close its icy grip around the valley. As October deepens, the temperature in the valley of Oymyakon begins its rapid, terrifying plunge. The sun barely rises above the southern horizon, casting long, pale shadows across the snow. The local elders begin to speak of the Siberian giant, a legendary, once-in-a-generation cold wave that periodically sweeps down from the Arctic Ocean, locking the region in a deep freeze that can last for weeks. The mercury is projected to drop to an unbelievable 71 degrees below zero. At this extreme temperature, the behavior of everyday materials changes entirely. Kerosene turns to a thick, useless gel. Even the one-vac, high-quality mercury in the trading post's thermometer will freeze solid inside its glass tube. The emotional stakes for Dulon's family are rising daily. Young Sarah's cough has returned with the first hard frost, her breathing shallow and labored in the Takshan, chilly night air. Dulon knows that his new Balagan must be more than just a shelter. It must function as a highly efficient heat retention machine. He cannot afford a single mistake. A single unsealed gap, a poorly sloped wall, or a miscalculated draft could allow the Arctic air to pool near the floor, freezing his daughter's lungs as she sleeps. Meanwhile, Stepan remains utterly confident in his grand izba. He has finished the log walls, spiked them tight with his iron pins, and installed his beautiful glass windows. He boasts to the other traders that his massive brick stove will easily handle any cold snap the valley can throw at him. He continues to mock Dulon's modest mud structure, which now looks like a low organic hump rising from the snow. Dulon ignores the trader's confidence. He knows that Stepan is relying on brute force to fight the winter, while the Yakut method relies on working in perfect harmony with the physical properties of the materials available. If you want to discover more about these incredible historic building methods and how our ancestors survived the most extreme climates on Earth, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Your support helps us continue to uncover these forgotten stories of human resilience. As Dulon finishes the timber framework of his Balagan, the first winds of the Siberian giant begin to howl through the treetops, a warning that the true test is about to begin. The first and perhaps most critical lesson of Siberian construction lies directly beneath your feet, the permafrost. In the Oymyakon Valley, the ground is permanently frozen to a depth of hundreds of feet. During the brief summer, only the top few inches of soil thaw, turning into a soft, wet mud, while the deeper layers remain as hard as solid granite. This presents a unique, dangerous paradox for builders. If you construct a warm, heavy house directly on top of the permafrost, the heat from your floor will slowly filter downward, melting the frozen soil beneath your foundation. Once the ice melts, the ground turns into a soft, liquid mud, causing the foundation to shift, the walls to a tilt, and the entire house to sink into a swampy, structural abyss. Dulon's first task is to solve this foundation problem without digging a single foot into the frozen earth. Instead of trying to sink posts into the permafrost, Dulon employs a method that has kept Yakut homes stable for centuries. He constructs wide, flat wooden foundation pads, known as uonok, which are cribbed together from dense larch timber. These pads act much like giant snowshoes, distributing the weight of the structure evenly across the frozen surface of the splaying ground. Dulon places these pads flat on the topsoil, then builds a sturdy framework of horizontal floor beams on top of them. This creates a low, open crawl space beneath the actual floor of the balagan. This cold air gap is the key to the entire foundation. During the winter, the freezing Arctic winds are allowed to circulate freely beneath the floorboards, keeping the ground underneath the house permanently frozen. Dulon has designed a thermal barrier of cold air that prevents the warmth of the living space from ever touching the permafrost. The ground remains as hard as rock, ensuring that the foundation of the balagan will never sink or shift. Even during the warmest summer thaws, Dulon lays the floor planks one by one, but he incorporates a crucial structural detail that most modern builders would miss. He stops the floorboards just short of the outer wall frame, leaving a deliberate 2-inch gap around the entire perimeter. This gap is not a mistake. It is an intentional design feature. When Dulon applies the thick mud plaster to the walls, the wet clay will flow downward into this gap, biting into both the floor and the frame. As it dries, it will seal the connection completely, killing any cold drafts at the ankle level before they can even enter the living space. Stepan, working on his izba nearby, has ignored this permafrost logic. He has dug his heavy vertical foundation posts directly into the topsoil, trusting that the sheer weight of his logs will hold the house steady. Dulon watches the merchant's progress with quiet concern, knowing that the warmth of Stepan's massive stove is already beginning to seep downward, setting a silent, structural trap that will spring once the ground begins its deep winter cycle. With the foundation pads secure, Dulon begins raising the main structural framework of the balagan. Unlike a European cabin with flat, vertical walls, the comfortofussex.com balagan is designed with walls that lean slightly inward, forming a shape like a truncated pyramid. This slope design is a masterclass in aerodynamic engineering. In the Siberian taiga, the winter winds are incredibly powerful, carrying enough force to rip shingles off roofs and find any structural weakness in a flat surface. By angling the walls of the balagan inward, Dulon ensures that when a storm hits, the wind does not slam into a flat barrier. Instead, the wind glides smoothly up and over the sloped surface of the house, reducing wind shear and preventing the storm from scouring heat directly from the walls. Furthermore, this inward slope converts the lateral force of the wind into a downward compression. The harder the storm pushes against the angled walls, the more securely the structure is pinned to its foundation pads, stabilizing the house during the worst blizzards. Dulon's method of joining the timber framework is equally deliberate. He avoids using iron spikes or nails entirely. Dulon knows that iron is a highly efficient thermal conductor. In the deep freeze of an Oymyak in winter, iron nails will T-Mitauman 80A conduct cold directly into the center of the wooden joints, causing the place 5 surrounding wood fibers to freeze, expand, and rot. Furthermore, at 70 blank degrees below zero, iron becomes incredibly brittle, snapping under the stress of shifting wood like dry twigs. Instead of metal, Doolan joins every beam using wooden pegs known as nagel, made of tough, seasoned birch. He carves these pegs by hand, fitting them into precisely drilled mortise and tenon joints. For the long, load-bearing joints, Doolan binds the timbers together with strips of raw horsehide. He applies the rawhide wet, wrapping it tightly around the wood. As the hide dries, it shrinks significantly, gripping the timber joints with thousands of pounds of compressive force. This creates a flexible, highly stable frame. Unlike a rigid nailed structure that will crack under stress, Doolan's rawhide-bound frame can flex and bend slightly during a major storm, absorbing the wind's energy rather than snapping. Doolan keeps the roof of the Grecian Balagan low and flat, reducing the overall height of the building to minimize its exposure to the wind. The rafters climb gently toward a small opening at the peak, the crown vent. This vent is not just a hole, it is a highly adjustable thermal valve that Doolan will use to regulate the temperature of the entire house once the deep freeze begins. The timber skeleton is now complete, but it is still just a drafty frame of wood. To turn this frame into a true survival machine, Doolan must apply its Ploss's protective skin. This skin is not made of expensive shingles or imported siding. It is made of a thick, organic plaster of clay, straw, and cow manure. Doolan begins mixing the plaster in late summer, while the ground is still soft and water is still liquid. He combines clay-rich soil gathered from the riverbank with chopped straw and aged cow manure, adding water until the mixture reaches the consistency of a thick, uniform paste. Each ingredient in this humble plaster serves a specific, highly technical purpose. The clay provides the structural foundation of the wall. Its clay provides the structural foundation of the wall. Microscopic mineral plates locking together tightly as the moisture evaporates. The chopped straw acts much like fiberglass fibers in modern concrete, creating a binding lattice that arrests hairline cracks before they can grow. But the true magic of the plaster lies in the manure. Manure is rich in digested vegetable fibers and organic proteins, which act as a natural, elastic binder. As the plaster dries, these proteins create an exceptionally flexible, water-resistant seal that prevents the clay from shrinking and cracking during extreme temperature shifts. Doolan applies the plaster in two distinct coats, working entirely by hand. The first coat is a meticulous hunt for drafts. Doolan presses the sticky paste into the wooden laths in every joint where the floor meets the frame, using his fingers to feel for any tiny void that a trowel might miss. He knows that every pinhole is a potential draft, a pathway for the freezing Arctic air to enter the house. This primary layer must stop convective heat loss completely. The second coat builds the actual body of the wall, feathered wide around window frames and rounded off at the corners of the building. By rounding the corners, Doolan ensures that the wind has no sharp edge to grab, further reducing wind shear and wind convective cooling. As the late autumn temperature drops below freezing, the mud shell undergoes its final, crucial cure. The moisture remaining within the plaster freezes, vitrifying the exterior of the balagan into a hard, glassy ice glaze. This glassy shell armors the walls against wind erosion and prevents snow from sticking to the surface. Inside the house, the cured plaster functions as a highly efficient thermal battery. When Doolan runs his stove hot during the day, the thick, dense mud walls absorb the surplus heat. At night, after the fire has burned down to embers, the mud walls slowly radiate that stored warmth back into the living space, maintaining a stable interior temperature. Furthermore, this organic shell acts as a biological lung. Because the fibers in the plaster are highly hygroscopic, they naturally absorb excess humidity from the family's breath and cooking. As the water vapor binds to the clay minerals, it undergoes a physical transition that releases a tiny amount of latent heat buffering the midnight chill. Unlike modern plastic vapor barriers that trap moisture and cause wood rot, the microscopic structure of the clay allows water vapor to diffuse slowly outward along a pressure gradient while blocking the bulk flow of freezing air. Dulon runs his hand across the cured interior wall, feeling a quiet mineral confidence. His balagan is now sealed, wrapped in an atri, organic, breathing shell that is ready to face the coldest winter on Earth. In the deep winter of Oymyakan, light is not something you buy. It is something you harvest from the frozen river. By early November, the Indijurka River has frozen to a depth of several feet, and Dulon knows it is time to prepare his windows. He travels to a quiet bend in the river, where the water flows slowly and the ice forms with absolute clarity. Dulon rejects the cloudy surface ice, which contains trapped air bubbles and debris that would scatter light. Instead, he chisels down into the deep, pristine layers, carving out thick, rectangular blocks of ice that gleam like cut crystal in the low winter sun. Dulon hauls these heavy ice blocks back to his balagan on a wooden sled. He shaves the edges of each block with a sharp knife until they fit perfectly into the stepped wooden frames he has built into his angled walls. To seal the windows, Dulon mixes fresh snow with river water to create a thick, freezing slush mortar. Dulon presses this slush into the gaps around the ice block. It freezes instantly, creating a permanent, airtight crystalline gasket that actually tightens as the temperature drops. These ice windows do not provide a clear view of the outside world, but they perform a vital function in Dulon's heating plan. The clear river ice diffuses the weak winter light, filling the interior of the balagan with a soft, ambient glow that spreads light much further into the room than a flat pane of glass ever could. On the coldest nights, a layer of delicate hoarfrost grows on the glassed interior surface of the ice. This frost acts much like the frost on a winter garden, trapping a thin layer of still air against the window. Still air is an exceptionally poor heat conductor, meaning that this frost layer actually adds to the window's insulation value, slowing the escape of radiant warmth. Stepan, in his izba nearby, has installed his beautiful glass windows using standard putty and iron brads. Dulon watches with quiet concern, knowing that glass has a high thermal conductivity. The cold outside will quickly chill Stepan's glass, creating a massive thermal bridge that will drain the heat from his living room and turn his beautiful windows into sheets of solid, dripping ice. Dulon turns back to his ice panes, satisfied with the soft, steady light filling his warm balagan. A truly successful survival shelter does not rely on wood fire alone. It utilizes every available source of thermal energy. In the design of the balagan, the most unusual and highly effective source of heat is completely biological. Dulon's dwarf cows are small, thick-haired, and exceptionally hardy, but they cannot survive the absolute worst of the Siberian winter in an unheated barn. Dulon's solution is to bring the cows into a partitioned bay, known as the kotan, which shares a wall with the main human living area. The kotan and the living room are separated only by a low log partition wall, made of dense larch logs. Dulon stables his 2 milk cows and their calf in this bay every evening. The animal's metabolism functions as a highly reliable, passive heater. A single adult cow generates approximately 1,500 BTUs of heat per hour through digestion and respiration. Dulon's small herd produces nearly 4,500 BTUs of thermal energy every hour, completely free of charge. This heat rises from the animal's warm bodies and filters slowly through the log partition, raising the baseline temperature of the human living space. This biological heat engine provides a critical safety margin. Even if Dulon's fire burns out completely in the middle of the night, the animal's body heat ensures that the temperature inside the living room will never drop below freezing. Dulon maintains this biological warmth through a carefully organized routine ensuring that his animals are well fed and their bedding is kept dry and clean. The dwarf cow's thick, insulated coats protect them from the drafty barn air, while their breath helps humidify the dry winter air inside the house. Stepan, who has stabled his own horses and cows in a separate, unheated barn across the clearing, mocks Dulon for living with his beasts. Stepan believes that a civilized man keeps his livestock far from his dwelling. Dulon simply continues his evening chores, knowing that the living heat of his cows is already protecting his sleeping daughters, while Stepan's separate barn is rapidly turning into an icy vault that will require massive amounts of supplemental heat to keep his animals alive. The final piece of Dulon's heating system is the air regulation, or what he refers to as the lung of the house. To keep a fire burning brightly without wasting heat, you must control the flow of air with absolute precision. Dulon's adjustable crown vent, located at the peak of the roof, and his low floor level inlets work together to utilize a natural physical phenomenon known as the stack effect. Warm air is less dense than cold air, causing it to rise naturally toward the nadi ceiling. In Dulon's arched balagan, this warm air is guided into a concentrated ridge at the peak, where it exits through the crown vent. As this warm air escapes, it creates a gentle vacuum inside the house, which pulls a steady, controlled stream of fresh oxygen through the low floor vents. This continuous air movement is vital for multiple reasons. First, it ensures that the fire in Dulon's clay-lined hearth always has enough oxygen to burn hot and clean, preventing the buildup of dangerous carbon monoxide. Second, it pulls any thin wood smoke out of the living space, keeping the air clean and breathable. Dulon tunes this ventilation system by ear and feel, adjusting the wooden shutter on the crown vent by a finger's width in response to the changing wind. If he hears a low, rumbling draft or a cough from the stove, he knows that the air is moving too fast, pulling valuable warmth out of the walls. He closes the frame shutter slightly, slowing the airflow until the sound settles into a steady, quiet hiss. This slow, regulated air exchange allows moisture from cooking and pervious breathing to migrate through the porous clay manure walls, preventing condensation from forming on the ceiling and dripping onto the family's beds. Dulon's system keeps the house dry, warm, and exceptionally efficient. Stepan, who has sealed his log cabin tightly with putty and rags, has no ventilation plan. He believes that a tight house is a warm house. Dulon knows that without airflow, Stepan's stove will starve for oxygen, producing thick, choking smoke that will fill his cabin, while the moisture from his family's breath will freeze directly on his uninsulated walls, turning his home into a damp, freezing cave. Dulon pulls his wool blanket over his shoulders, listening to the steady, rhythmic hum of his balagan, confident that his family is breathing clean, warm air through the coldest night of the year. Part 4. The Siberian Giant Unleashed. The blizzard strikes in the second week of January, carrying the full fury of the Siberian Giant. The wind howls out of the Arctic at 50 miles per hour, driving the temperature down to an unbelievable 71 degrees below zero. In this extreme cold, the air itself turns into a thick, frozen fog, and the forest is filled with the constant, terrifying sound of freezing larch trees, exploding in the dark. The wind is relentless, finding every tiny crack and gap in every building in the valley, scouring heat off vertical wood surfaces, and threatening to freeze anyone caught outside in minutes. Inside his balagan, Dulon stands by the clay-lined hearth, listening to the storm. His house has undergone a physical transition that has turned his mud shell into a highly efficient armor. The extreme frost has frozen the last of the moisture within the clay plaster, vitrifying the exterior of the house into a hard, glassy ice armor. This glassy glaze prevents the wind from penetrating the walls and sheds the heavy snow, allowing it to pile up naturally around the farking base of the slanted walls to form a thick, insulating skirt. Inside, the temperature holds at a stable and comfortable 68 degrees. Dulon has fired his hearth once that morning, using a moderate pile of dried cow dung blocks that smolder, with a steady, long-lasting intensity. The thick mud walls have absorbed that thermal energy, and now they are slowly radiating that warmth back into the living space. Dulon's young daughter, Sarah, is sleeping soundly on her wooden platform, her breathing deep and regular, her cough completely gone. Dulon's wife, Chaska, is working on her sewing, wearing only a light flannel shirt. There are no drafts, no cold corners, no frost forming on the inside of the walls. Dulon's traditional mud house is performing exactly as his ancestors designed it to, turning the worst cold wave of the century into a quiet, warm sanctuary of survival. Dulon sits by the warm stone, his heart filled with a quiet relief, knowing that his work has kept his family safe. But just across the clearing, a very different scene is playing out. Stepan's grand izba is failing rapidly under the stress of the extreme cold. Stepan's thick pine logs have shrunk as they froze, separating from each other and pulling loose from his iron spikes, which have snapped under the structural tension. The relentless wind is now driving Arctic air through the gaps in his logs, creating freezing drafts that have dropped his interior temperature to near freezing. His beautiful glass windows have shattered due to the extreme temperature difference between the blazing indoor fire and the negative 71 degrees Celsius outdoor cold, letting in the howling wind. Stepan and his family are huddled together near his massive brick stove, burning their remaining furniture in a desperate attempt to stay warm. But the heat is escaping through his shattered windows faster than the fire can replace it. Stepan's hands are shaking, his ears are turning white with frostbite, and his children are crying from the brutal cold. Dulon, checking on his stabled cows in the kotan, notices that Stepan's cabin is dark, with no warm smoke rising from its chimney. He knows the danger. Dulon grabs his heavy fur coat, opens his low wooden door, and struggles through the beatus, howling wind toward Stepan's place. He finds the trader and his family shivering. In the dark, near collapse, Dulon does not hesitate. He helps Stepan up, wraps his coat around the trader's shivering shoulders, and guides the family back through the blinding snow to his warm mud balagan. As Stepan steps through the Waitian low door, the wave of 68-degree warmth hits him like a physical thing. He collapses onto Dulon's warm stone bench, tears of relief and shame freezing on his cheeks as his circulation begins to return. Stepan looks around the Clyde, modest mudroom, seeing Dulon's family comfortable and warm, and is forced to confront his own pride. He realizes that the Yakut's humble mud and manure house, which he had mocked so publicly, is actually a masterpiece of engineering a structure that has just saved his family's lives. The storm finally breaks on the fourth day, leaving the Oymyakon Valley locked in a quiet, sparkling frost. Stepan, his hands still bandaged where the K4 frostbite had begun to heal, stands in the center of Dulon's warm balagan, looking at the simple mud walls with a profound, newfound respect. He turns to Dulon, his voice quiet and filled with a deep, universal emotion. He expresses his gratitude, acknowledging that without Dulon's help and his incredible mud house, his family would not have survived the night of negative 71 degrees Celsius. Stepan apologizes for his earlier arrogance, admitting that he was wrong to dismiss the Plasan, traditional Yakut methods. Dulon simply smiles, places a warm hand on Stepan's shoulder, and tells him that there is no need for apologies. Dulon explains that survival in Oymyakon is not about proving who is stronger. It is about learning from the past and helping one another when the winter turns mean. The two men, once separated by pride and cultural assumptions, have forged a deep, lifelong bond of mutual respect. Stepan resolves to use his trading resources to help Dulon source better iron, tools for his farm, while Dulon promises that when the spring thaw arrives, will help Stepan rebuild his trading post, this time with inward-sloping walls, birch pegs, and a thick, protective shell of clay and straw. The winter of 1892 eventually faded into a muddy, reluctant spring, but the 21 lesson learned in the Oymyakon Valley remained frozen in the minds of its settlers. Stepan's destroyed log cabin was never rebuilt in the European fashion. Instead, when the ground thawed, he worked alongside Dulon to build a new home, one with inwardly sloping walls and a thick mud and straw plaster. By the turn of the century, the Balagan design had gained newfound respect among the regional traders and settlers who had once laughed at it. They realized that survival in the far north was not a battle of dominance, but a test of humility and observation. Today, while modern heating systems and insulated materials have reached the coldest corners of Yakutia, Dulon's original mud-plastered home still stands as a historical landmark. The hand-fitted stones and vitrified clay walls remain intact, a quiet, mineral monument to the ancestral wisdom that turned the harshest winter on Earth into a place of warmth.